Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we will pick up where we left off with chapter 6 of No Regrets by Ace Frehley from Kiss. Here we go. It's hard to know exactly when it's time to let go of your dreams. By the fall of 1972, I was 21 years old, dead broke, still living at home with my parents, playing in an assortment of bands, hoping that one of them would turn out to be the right vehicle for my guitar playing. I still believed in myself, still thought I could make a living as a professional musician, but there was no plan. No strategy. There was mainly just a lot of gigging and practicing and partying. Through it all, Jeanette remained supportive, if somewhat quizzical. I remember driving around one night in her car. I didn't have the bread to buy my own wheels, talking about the future, trying to explain why I didn't want a day job, why I thought I'd wither in the 9-to-5 world. It's a waste of my time and talent, I told her. I'm going to be a rock star. Trust me, we'll be rich someday. Jeanette laughed. You're out of your mind. True enough, you have to be a little bit nuts to be an artist in the first place. We don't look at the world like most people, just as you have to be somewhat detached from reality to think that you can beat the 1,000,000-to-1 odds stacked against anyone who tries to make it in the music business. On both counts, I was guilty. I'm also an inherently lazy guy. If something doesn't motivate me in a visceral way, I'm unlikely to embrace it with any sort of discipline or enthusiasm. That's why I was a bad student, and it's why I would have been, and was, a lousy employee. I loved playing the guitar, and I knew I was pretty good at it, so that's what I wanted to do with my life. There were no other options. I had to be patient and wait for the right opportunity to come along, which it did, in the form of an advertisement that appeared in the Village Voice on December 17th, 1972. Lead guitarist wanted, with flash and ability, album out shortly. No time wasters, please. Paul. I didn't know who Paul was, nor did I know anything about the band he fronted or the supposed record deal they had secured. This was a free ad, one of hundreds I had read over the years. Like any New York musician with an ounce of ambition, I scanned the classifieds regularly, looking for new and interesting opportunities, especially with bands that claimed to have record contracts or upcoming tours. There was no shortage of these. From experience, though, I knew most were pure bull and thus easily ignored. For some reason, though, this one was intriguing. I figured, I have flash, and I sure as have ability. I doubted the part about the band having an album out soon, but it seemed worth investigating, at the very least. So I picked up the phone and dialed the number that appeared at the bottom of the Village Voice ad. On the phone was the man who had placed the ad, Paul Stanley. It wasn't until much later that I would discover that his real name was Stanley Eisen. I still find it interesting that I was the only member of Kiss who performed under his actual surname. Paul was professional and businesslike on the phone. He asked me about my credentials and my appearance. I look a little like Keith Richards, I said, playing up the fact that I was tall, skinny, and had long hair. Pretty much the way every guitar player looked in those days. Told me a little bit about their project, about how they wanted to be a theatrical band that played loud, hard rock, and then told me they would be conducting auditions in a couple of weeks. "You're welcome to come down," he said. I hesitated, partly because I didn't want to seem too eager, but also because I was naturally skeptical. I had been down this road before, most recently with Molimo. The idea of auditioning for a group of guys who probably didn't even have a record deal, and for all I knew, couldn't play worth a, didn't exactly get my motor running. "Maybe," I said. "I'll think about it." I decided to get some feedback from my buddy, Chris Cassone, who was also a guitar player and who would later become a successful sound engineer. "Hey Chris, you see that ad in the Village Voice?" "Yeah," he said. "Interesting." "I know, man. I'm thinking about going down there." There was a pause. "Me too." This surprised me. Chris was a solid guitar player, but he really didn't have the rock star look. He dressed like a prep school kid and didn't have long hair. "Don't take this the wrong way, Chris, but I'm not sure you have the image they want." The open audition was scheduled for January 3rd, 1973, which gave me a few weeks to consider the invitation. If I had known the truth at the time, I probably would have stayed home that day, which obviously would have been the mistake of a lifetime. What I did know, fortunately, was that Paul and his partner in this project, Gene Klein, whom I would come to know as Gene Simmons, had played together in a band called Wicked Lester. And while they had indeed been offered a contract from Epic Records, that deal had fallen through. So the ad, like so many others I'd come across, was not entirely true. At the very least, it was misleading. But that's okay. It's become part of Kiss mythology, and I'm cool with that. Just as I'm alright with some people thinking the Village Voice advertisement sought a guitarist with flash and balls. Nope, the term was flash and ability. Paul and Gene have long maintained that the Village Voice refused to print the word balls, and instead substituted ability. I don't know if that's true or not. Seems unlikely, considering the Voice was a liberal publication that had never been shy about allowing profanity on its pages. But it makes for a good story, I guess. Here's another good story. My mom had to drive me to the audition. I had come to the conclusion that I had nothing to lose. What was the worst that could happen? I'd get to jam with some guys downtown. If they were talentless hacks and the whole thing turned out to be fraudulent, well, so what? I'd have invested nothing more than a few hours of my time, and maybe, just maybe, it would turn out to be something more than that. On the afternoon of the audition, I dragged my 50-watt Marshall amp, armed with 8 10-inch speakers, out to the curb and stuffed it into the trunk of my parents' Cadillac. There was no requirement for aspirants to show up with their own amp, but I thought it would give me more confidence and more of an edge. I also presumed my Marshall would be superior to anything these guys had at their loft. It was a great amp, and it sounded even better with my single pickup Gibson reverse Firebird blowing through its speakers, the same model Clapton used on the Cream Farewell tour. I knew how to get great sustain and feedback out of this combo, and I wasn't willing to settle for something less. There had been other times when I had plugged into someone else's amp. The results had almost always been disappointing. I'll say this about my mom. She was pretty cool about the whole thing. She knew I had talent and probably figured if I was going to make something of myself in life, music would be the likely avenue. And of course, I was her baby boy, so she worried and fretted about my happiness and safety. When I told her I needed a ride downtown to audition for this new band, couldn't bring the amp on the subway, and I didn't have the money for cab fare. She was more than willing to lend a hand. I don't think she had any inkling that it would turn out the way it did. You never know if any audition will lead to anything, right? Most are dead ends. As she sat behind the wheel of the caddy, waiting for me to load my gear into the trunk, I'm sure her mind was elsewhere, probably trying to figure out what we would have for dinner that night. It couldn't possibly have occurred to her that I was about to join what would become one of the biggest rock groups in the world. It hadn't occurred to me either. Interestingly, though, as we pulled up to the curb on 23rd Street, just off 5th Avenue, where the audition would occur, I felt a strangely intense attack of the jitters. It was almost like I sensed there was something important about this one. There was no reason to feel that, but I did. I got out of the car and leaned into the window. "Wait here a second, Mom. I'll be right back." I jogged off in the direction of a deli just a few doors down the street as my mother yelled, "Where are you going?" I returned a few minutes later with a 16-ounce can of beer stuffed into a brown paper bag. I popped the trunk, withdrew my amp and guitar, and dragged them into the small lobby of the building. There, alone beside the elevator, I popped the can and chugged the contents. Okay, good to go. The loft was basically just a long, dark, narrow room with dozens of empty egg cartons glued to the walls and ceiling for soundproofing. There were 3 people already in the band, and all 3 were there that day. The drummer Peter Criss, the bass player Gene Simmons, and the rhythm guitar player Paul Stanley, with whom I'd already talked on the phone. It was pretty obvious that Gene was in charge of the audition. He was the most serious member of the trio, and seemed not to have even the slightest sense of humor. My introduction to the guys in Kiss, although they weren't called Kiss as yet, wasn't particularly smooth. I mean, I wouldn't say it was love at first sight. There had been a steady stream of musicians going in and out of the loft all day. Each was required to fill out a job application before auditioning. Now, I don't think I'd ever filled out a job application in my life, not even for a real job. The one exception being the holiday season a couple of years earlier, when I worked briefly for Uncle Sam as a letter carrier. And I wasn't about to do it for this gig. Being a musician wasn't a job to me. It was a way of life. If they wanted to know more about me, they could ask. I took a seat, read a few lines of the application, and then crumpled it up and tossed it on the floor. I'm sure that didn't go over very well with the boys, just as I'm sure they weren't thrilled with my attitude. Yeah, I did in fact look a little bit like Keith Richards, as advertised. I had the shag haircut, the bony frame with veins popping out on my forearms. I wore the requisite t-shirt and jeans, nothing too wild or psychedelic, just straight up rock and roll. With one little quirk. My sneakers didn't match. One was red, the other orange. A lot has been made of this over the years. Was Ace too spaced out to know what he was doing? Too nervous to realize he'd picked mismatched shoes out of the closet? Was it a fashion statement? Here's the truth. I was in a hurry and grabbed 2 sneakers, slipped them on, and rushed out the door. By the time I realized what I had done, we were on our way downtown. I wasn't worried, though. I thought I looked kind of cool. Gene and the boys, I would later discover, had a different response. They thought I was, at best, up. At worst, inconsiderate. It didn't help matters that I wasn't entirely respectful of the audition process. Protocol dictates silence while waiting your turn, but as the guy ahead of me was finishing up, his name was Bob Kulick, and he would come to be associated with Kiss in a number of different ways over the years, though never as a live performer. I pulled out my guitar and started warming up with some scales in the far corner of the room. My actions were definitely a distraction. As they conducted a post-audition interview with Bob, I continued to play, trying to stay loose. When Gene saw what I was doing, he walked right over and got in my face. "You know, that's pretty rude. Why don't you put your guitar away and sit down and wait your turn?" "Oh, sorry, man." I can look back on all this now and laugh. Maybe the guys can laugh too. At the time, though, I'm sure they weren't real appreciative of my behavior, and probably didn't anticipate I'd be the person who would eventually end up in the band. But it all comes down to one thing in the end. Can you play the guitar or not? I could play, and I had the image. The audition itself went smoothly. Well, not counting the part where Gene threatened to kick my butt if it turned out I was wasting their time. My reaction to that, unspoken as I still wanted the job, was, "Who is this hole? Doesn't he know I could break him in half?" In terms of playing, I hadn't known what to expect. Sometimes at an audition, you'll jam to something familiar, but these guys put me to the test. "We're going to play one of our songs," Paul explained. "It's called Deuce. See if you can keep up." Honestly, I think they were trying to get rid of me as quickly as possible. It's not easy to hear someone else's material for the first time and try to jump right in on lead guitar. In fact, it's hard as... But that's what we did. They told me what key they'd be playing in, and they gave me a demonstration. After a few minutes, they paused and invited me to jam along. "I'll cue you when it's time for the solo," Paul said. I nodded. At the appointed time, I ripped a blistering solo, tried to impress them with every cool lick I had in my repertoire. I wasn't even sure if it was what they were looking for, but it felt right. I liked the energy in the room. I liked the fact that they were playing loud and hard, and I really liked the song itself a lot. I remember thinking, if this is the kind of stuff these guys are writing, then they might just be onto something. We played for about 20 minutes, maybe a half hour, at the end of which they thanked me for my time and sent me on my way, offering little in the way of an assessment. "Nice job," Paul said, shaking my hand. "Thanks for coming. We'll be in touch." Gene and Peter also shook my hand and smiled in agreement. And as I walked toward the door, I could hear Peter talking to Paul and Gene. "Yeah, very cool," he said with a laugh. "I love Chinese food." I wasn't quite sure what he meant at the time, since I was so excited about what had just happened. But afterward, I remembered that sometimes people thought I was of Asian descent. The elusive Cherokee strain in my blood confused people at times. I guess that's what happened with Peter. Really, though, all that mattered to me was that these guys seemed to know what they were doing. They were professional and seemed focused and on the same page as me. I don't want to overstate matters. I felt like I nailed the audition, and I felt like these guys had potential, but I didn't have expectations for changing the world or anything. It wasn't that dramatic. It would be one thing if I walked in and they had makeup on and a record deal in hand, but it was just three guys sitting in a loft with egg cartons on the walls. It was very businesslike and low-key. Nevertheless, I wanted in. For the next few days, I floated along, indulging in the occasional daydream about joining the new band and maybe hitting the big time. I had left the audition feeling confident that I would get the gig. They were still going to listen to a few more people, Close to 30 guitar players ultimately tried out for the job, but I had the sense that things would work out in my favor, and I was excited about it. The songs we played were catchy, and Paul, Gene, and Peter were all solid musicians. Granted, I had barely gotten to know these guys, but I could tell they were serious. In all the years I'd been playing music, I had never been in a band where everyone seemed not only committed to the cause, but equipped with the necessary chops. Also, they had made it clear up front that they were willing to do anything necessary in order to fulfill their dreams. So was I. They wanted to be a theatrical rock group, and I was totally on board with that. Gene used to say, Kiss not only gives you something for your ears, but something for your eyes as well. I believed in that. I had been heavily influenced by Hendrix setting his guitar on fire, by Pete Townsend smashing his guitar. I liked smoke bombs and fireworks and special effects. I liked the show, and I understood how visual effects could supplement the music and make the concert experience more memorable. As different as we were personally, as divergent as our backgrounds might have been, we shared a collective vision and ambition. We just had different ways of dealing with things. You have to understand, I was a happy-go-lucky guy, and I was just going with the flow. I thought maybe it would work out. Maybe not. As the days went by, maybe not seemed the more likely scenario. Then the guy showed up to watch me play in a club, and finally, in mid-January, about 2 weeks after my initial audition, I received a phone call from Paul. He wanted to know if I could come down to the loft and hang out with the guys again. I said, sure, why not? When I arrived, Peter's wife Lydia was there, as was Gene's girlfriend. I suppose they wanted another set of eyes, female eyes, to determine whether the new guy looked like a good fit. We talked for a little while, jammed a bit, and then they offered me the job. By this time, I had learned that the band actually had no recording contract, which probably should have made me skeptical, but it really didn't. Bands and musicians inflated their resumes all the time. I knew from personal experience that record deals were every bit as fragile as the records themselves. The important thing was that I liked the material, and I had a good feeling about it. I liked the attitude of everyone in the band. Whether I would get along with them personally was hard to say, and didn't really factor into the equation. All I cared about was that they were ambitious. They wanted to make it professionally. I had been playing with other people, been in other bands, and it always seemed like everyone had too much noise in their lives. They held day jobs and did gigs on the weekends. They had wife and kids. They had car payments and rent. Some even had mortgages. Not me. I had my guitar and nothing else. Music was my life, and it was nice to get together with 3 other guys who seemed just as single-minded. We started rehearsing almost immediately at the 23rd Street loft. Kind of a pain in the butt for me, since I still didn't have a car or enough money for a daily cab fare. Obviously, I wasn't going to ask my mother to drive me to rehearsal every day, so I had to find alternative means of transportation. Sometimes I took the subway to Manhattan. More often, though, I turned to friends for help. Most notably, a cat named Eddie Solon. Eddie would drive to the Bronx from his house in Yonkers, and then we'd go downtown together in his Volkswagen Bug. Eddie wasn't a musician, but he deserves a lot of credit for what Kiss accomplished in the early days. Not only was he a loyal friend and good sound mixer, but he was also a master carpenter and electronics wizard who built the PA system for our first shows. By day, Eddie worked as an electronics supply store. By night, he was an unofficial member of Kiss, the band's very first roadie, and so much more. Eddie was really into mixing and sound, and I don't think his efforts and contributions during the early days of the band have ever been sufficiently acknowledged. We rehearsed 4, 5, 6 days a week, probably overkill, considering we had less than a dozen songs. We'd play them repeatedly, for hours on end. This wasn't easy for me. While I loved playing the guitar, my approach to the craft was less workmanlike than some of the other guys in the band. I took the artist's approach. When inspiration strikes, I'll be ready. Peter was kind of the same way. Paul and Gene, They were workaholics, committed to practicing until their fingers bled, and then turning their attention straight to the business end of things. Admirable, I admit, but it wasn't the way I lived my life, and in the beginning, I found it curious, not to mention exhausting. But I got used to it pretty quickly. We spent a lot of time in close quarters in those first few months, rehearsing, planning our shows, talking about image, and the direction we wanted the band to take. Considering all the problems and personality conflicts we'd have down the road, it's worth noting how well we all got along in the beginning. I wouldn't say we were best friends, because that just wouldn't be true. We were very different people. As a result, our relationships were, at first, and then much later, more businesslike than anything else. Everything was very diplomatic, with each band member putting in his own 2 cents worth on all subjects, regardless of how important or trivial. Paul and Gene did most of the songwriting in the beginning, but once I got the hang of it, I started writing as well, and so did Peter, although to a lesser extent. We all became friends, but once we started working together on the road, Paul and Gene quickly became aware of the fact that Peter and I were a little different from them. We liked to party hard. Everybody partied, but in different ways and to varying degrees. Gene, for example, doesn't drink, and Paul hardly drinks at all. But Gene, especially, was a total. Peter and I were the more traditional and hardcore partiers in the group, favoring alcohol, with women merely part of the mix. Like me, Peter had been a member of a gang when he was younger, and his personality had been partially shaped by that experience. We gravitated toward each other as the band went forward. But I don't want to imply that the 4 of us didn't get along. We did, especially in the formative months and years. You can't spend that much time together working toward a common goal without fashioning some type of bond, just as you can't help but get on each other's nerves after a while. By any reasonable standard, we were destitute. A few of us had part-time jobs. Paul and I drove cabs. Gene worked at a magazine, but there was never much money. It didn't seem to matter. We all believed that soon enough we'd be supporting ourselves solely as musicians. We had good songs, solid musicianship, and confidence that there was a market for theatrical rock. We wanted to take it further than any of the acts that inspired and influenced us, like The Who, Hendrix, The Move, Alice Cooper, and the New York Dolls. The Dolls were a gender-bending pre-punk group fronted by David Johansen and Johnny Thunders. They wore high heels and makeup and generally favored androgynous clothing. They influenced a lot of other musicians on the New York scene, and they had an effect on Kiss, both musically and stylistically. So did Alice, probably even to a greater degree, because Alice's sound was more polished and commercial, and his show revolved around theatrics. Alice Cooper in the 1970s brought blood and guts to the stage, combining rock and performance art in a way that had never been attempted. He wasn't just a singer, he was a character in his own band, and that character did crazy, repulsive things in the name of art. Alice, like the dolls, wore androgynous fashion, only with a sadomasochistic flavor. He utilized guillotines and snakes and buckets of blood in his shows, and people loved it. Well, not all of the people, obviously. Conservative groups and more than a few parents thought Alice was doing the devil's work and corrupting kids. They hated him, a response that predictably helped fuel sales of record albums and concert tickets. Alice knew exactly what he was doing. He made melodic but hard commercial rock, and he sold it with a grisly flourish, as well as a wink and a nod, I might add, though not everyone noticed, promising to make every night Halloween. It was nothing short of brilliant. He's now one of the most recognizable icons in rock and roll. Little did I know, Alice and I would become good friends later on down the road. We knew from the beginning that we wanted to follow his lead. We wanted to wear makeup and have outlandish costumes and play hard rock. Beyond that, we weren't so sure. We also weren't sure about what we wanted to call ourselves. Choosing the right name was important. It had to be a good fit, convey the right image and attitude, and we all had to be comfortable with it. Looking back now, I realized that one of the things that made KISS unique was the fact that we were such a democratic organization. That may seem hard to believe now, with only Gene and Paul left from the original lineup, and Gene having so carefully cultivated an image of calm control. But we were 4 equal partners almost from the moment the lineup was complete. Names were tossed around for several weeks, with most being discarded in a matter of minutes. At one point, probably out of exasperation, someone suggested that we call the band simply and graphically. That one too suffered a quick demise. We wanted to be radical. We wanted to really push the envelope in a way no other band had done. Would have done the trick. It also would have made it impossible to get a record deal, or radio airplay, or any of the other things we wanted to achieve. So, that wasn't going to work. Was a dead end, in the same way that my old band would have been a dead end. You want to be taken seriously as a band? Well then, your name can't be a punchline, and it can't be so profane that no one will want to say it out loud unless they're really pissed off. Eventually, we began talking about other bands we had been in, mainly as a source of inspiration. One name can cause a spark, and suddenly you're tossing out ideas until finally you settle on something that just feels right. I had been through the process multiple times with other bands. It was simple brainstorming, and it usually worked. Peter had once been in a band called Lips, and at some point the conversation went in that general direction until finally Paul suggested KISS. The collective response was, that's not bad. It was that simple, that organic. It was the same way with the now famous or infamous KISS logo. As soon as we settled on the name, I went home and started messing around with various stylistic renderings of the band name. While it's true that I wasn't much of a student when it came to traditional courses, I did have artistic ability. In fact, I used to double up in art at DeWitt Clinton. I got really close to the head of the art department, Doc Goldberg. He encouraged my interest in sketching and design. He'd even write passes for me when I came in late. Doc was used to dealing with students who had trouble fitting in. Most of the kids in his department were uncomfortable in a public school setting, but that didn't mean they lacked talent. They were just different. I was one of the best artists at DeWitt Clinton. I even designed a very cool psychedelic cover for the biannual school magazine, The Magpie. My idea was to sketch the words Youth Revolts on the cover, but the faculty advisor on the project felt that was too inflammatory. How about Youth Dissent, she suggested. That might be better. I'm not sure I even understood the meaning of the word dissent, but I did as I was told, and the cover still looked very cool. After moving on to Roosevelt High, I was prompted by my art teacher to enter one of my paintings in an art competition involving all the high school students in the 5 boroughs of New York City. That's more than 100,000 kids. I was good enough to have won an Art Achievement Award, naming me one of the top 100 high school artists in the city, and my painting was displayed in the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan. Not bad for a street punk from the Bronx. Like Paul, I probably should have gone to the High School of Art and Design in Manhattan. I definitely would have had a better academic career, that's for sure. But I didn't want it bad enough. I loved art, but I loved music even more, and constantly dreamt about where it could take me. Like I said, I lacked focus and discipline. Being excited about my new band, I roughed out a sketch of the original KISS logo in no time at all. It wasn't a whole lot different than the logo as it appears today. My original concept featured the twin S's in jagged detail, like lightning bolts, and a small dot in the shape of a diamond over the letter I. I then transferred the logo to a button using a felt-tip pen and presented it to the group. I later dropped a diamond over the I, and that was that. Designing one of the most recognizable rock logos in history wasn't really that difficult. Everyone loved it. Paul was a trained artist, so when things got really serious, he polished my design, making everything nice and neat. Thanks, Paul. And that's how KISS became capital K-I-S-S. Incidentally, there was never any secret meaning to the logo or the name. I thought lightning bolts would look cool, and I had already decided that my character in the band would be called the Spaceman, and that my costume would be adorned with lightning bolts, so it all went together. As for the notion that KISS was some sort of satanic metal band with the name an acronym for Knights in Satan's Service, complete and utter bull. All that satanic came out of left field. More precisely, it came out of the Southern Bible Belt, where so many of our fans were reared. I remember on some of our early tours, there were religious fanatics outside the shows, burning our records, saying we were devil worshippers. Give me a break. I was brought up a Lutheran. Peter was a Catholic, and Jean and Paul were Jews. None of us had ever been involved in any sort of satanic activity. Period. The truth is, not only were we not a satanic metal band, but we weren't really a metal band at all. We were just a melodic, hard rock band. Some of our songs were pop, some were heavy rock, bordering on metal, but I never thought of us as a metal band per se. As for the protesters, well, I didn't pay that much attention to them, but I kind of believed in the old adage, any publicity is good publicity. Really though, if KISS stood for anything, it was a far more common acronym. Keep it simple, stupid. That saying would end up having a much more profound meaning to me later on in my life. Just play the music, play it well, play it loud, and look good doing it. Well, that's the end of Chapter 6. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 6 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.